Hi, my name's Dale Adams of Planning Ahead of Time. On this week's Pat Chat, I'm speaking to Tara. Tara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Dale, for having me on your Pat Chat, firstly. It's really been great to meet you this past week. And I am a conscious grief guide. I facilitate small groups. I have an 11-week program called the Conscious Grief Program, which companions people who are in grief. And I try to put people into small groups of relatable grief. So widow group or child loss group, parent loss group. So I do group work, I do individual one-on-one coaching, and I teach grief yoga and breath work. And I include a session of each of those things on the Conscious Grief program as well. And this year, I can and rarely ever call myself an author. I have published my first book, which is called Conscious Grief: Transforming Pain into Evolution and Growth. And this book actually follows, each chapter is pretty much a week of my Conscious Grief program. So that's how I organize the book, actually. And it includes a bit of my story, but it also includes many other people's stories, of people that I've interviewed, a little bit like, what we're doing now together.
Yeah. So there is quite a history and a story of your own, isn't there, as to why you got into this work? Are you happy to share some of that?
Yes, of course. My father died very suddenly of a heart attack when I was 9 years old, and he was 42. And that was in 1990, which feels like another time, doesn't it? It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then my mother, she got remarried quite quickly. I'm one of three. So my mother was widowed with three children. She got married again, wasn't a good marriage. So then she got divorced. And that was like very painful for me, actually, even though he wasn't really the best father figure. But, divorce is another big grief. And then my mother had to sell our family business, another big grief. And when I was 18, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She did go into remission for 1 year, but it came back. And she passed away when she was 57 and I was 21. I mean, I just couldn't believe that that could happen, that another parent would die. And I was at such a young age. And I guess I just didn't want, my mother, the way she modeled to us to deal with grief was to stay busy and be strong. When my father died, and she did those things, and she was very busy running a business and whatnot. So when I was 21, that's what I did. I wanted to go to London. I wanted to live a normal life like everybody else. I didn't want people to feel sorry for me. And I sort of put my parents and all this pain in a box and left it in Reading, I think, where I grew up. And it wasn't, I knew that I was always masking all this sadness, pushing it down, using all the distractions. In my late 20s, I knew that something wasn't right. I started therapy, and obviously going back into the past. And I started doing self-development workshops and really getting quite interested in this world of healing and helping people. And I was in fashion beforehand. And over the years, I just started thinking, I'd really like to do something more in the realm of helping people. And I found, and I was quite enamored actually by the United States. I had friends living there and found this master's degree in spiritual psychology. This is kind of where my book starts, actually, because in the second year of that master's degree, you had to choose a project of your choice. And I was really thinking about learning Spanish, which I'm still trying to do. And yoga was very interesting to me. I was thinking about studying that. And then three different people on separate occasions said, I think you should go and talk to this lady, Paula, to help you decide.
Yeah.
So I had a session with her and she said, I think you need to do something on the death of your father. And I walked away from that meeting kind of a bit annoyed, actually, that I'd gone to speak to her, because I thought, oh, everybody else is doing these quite fun, interesting projects, and she wants me to think about the death of my father for a year. That sounds really depressing. But then I thought about it for a few days and I thought, actually, I always want to talk about death, but nobody else really does. And maybe this could be a very interesting idea. So that was the beginning. And I'd never really read any books about grief. And even though I'd had therapy and coaching, no one had ever really explained to me about how grief can impact us. And obviously through that project, I started to read about it. I started to interview different people who'd experienced loss. And I was like, how did I not know any of this beforehand? And then I really started to kind of process my grief. And that's when I talk about how that's when I started to consciously grieve. And, my mum having all that sort of accumulative grief over 11 years, I really felt that's what, materialized in the breast cancer. And so that's why I'm also very interested in how grief can impact us, not just on an emotional level, but also on a physical level as well.
Yeah, I do very much believe, as you've obviously just said, that actually our emotions can manifest physically, because we are, mind, body, and soul, we're all totally connected. So what is going on in our mind? But if you really think about the fact that you've got a headache, you'll give yourself a headache. That doesn't mean that we give ourselves cancer, obviously. Don't mean it like that. But I do mean that, it can sit and it can affect us so much physically. And pain does that, especially when you shove it down, and that's emotional pain. And it was very interesting. It's lovely to see Kenny here.
Yes, Kenny's on my lap.
At first, it just looked like you sort of picked up a teddy bear, and then all of a sudden put the rest of his head up. So, but it's so interesting of you talking about grief. And when you mentioned it, you then said, the divorce, and again, losing a business, moving out of a home, these, losing a pet, everything. There's so much to grief. And people often see grief as only when you lose a physical person or even a pet. But it's not. There's so much more to it than that, isn't it? It's very relationship driven. And we have relationships with our businesses, with our homes, with our friends. And I think that's also very important. Does that come up a lot in what you do?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I'd love to do, because I like to put people in certain groups, and there's not a group for every type of grief, but obviously, like, when you start really working on your grief and leaning into it and dealing with it consciously, you realize that there are all these other secondary losses or other areas of your life, that maybe you realize you hadn't grieved. And I think every kind of issue ends up coming down to grief, in a sense, because often we really, we're so avoidant of wanting to feel any sort of discomfort in the age that we live in. And we have so many distractions that can pull us away from it. Or people, maybe you had a breakup with somebody and maybe it was only a couple of months relationship, so you don't feel like it really warrants, feeling that bad about. Or people sort of say things, oh, I didn't really like him anyway, or there was somebody out there better for you, or, very dismissive of really like just sitting with the feelings of the sadness and labeling it as grief. And I think that all these, like, maybe smaller griefs, if you like, that we might be accumulating and just pushing down, at some point, I think they, need to kind of be given a voice, if you like, and to be nurtured.
Yeah, it needs to come out, doesn't it? It needs to move through us, as my coach would say. And when you're talking there, for me, the grief can layer. So you was talking about a breakup that maybe somebody was only with that person for a couple of months and they break up. But that isn't the only grief they're suffering, because it's bringing up pain from the past. So it may be that that was only a couple of months, but the grief that they suffer can have layered on top of previous breakups, or if you like, a father leaving them, and then it all sort of accumulates into something much bigger, and then they can't understand why they feel the way they do, as you've just stated, and why they feel so bad. So with the, obviously the grief, you have your conscious grief program, but you've also mentioned that you do yoga, and that's how I first met you, is because I saw about one of your classes. I've not heard of grief yoga at that point, so I decided to join and see what it was all about. Well, I really enjoyed it, but maybe you can tell people how yoga can help grief.
Well, I firstly would say that I think all types of yoga can help grief, and it's an opportunity for us to go inwards and, you know, become into more awareness of how our body's feeling. And something happens in a yoga class where you just do feel more, you know, and it really can peel more layers, you know, if you like, of our grief. So grief yoga was created by Paul Denniston, and he is from Los Angeles. His partner is David Kessler, who is very prolific in the grief world. And yeah, he created this specific yoga to process our grief. And he says, you know, it uses movement, breath, and sound to release pain and suffering, to return us back to a place of peace and love. And so the hour of the yoga, you know, is divided into 4 parts of awareness, expression, connection, and surrender. And there's a lot of postures which in the expression part, you know, are ways of really like releasing some anger, resentment, frustration. And we often don't have many places to do that, you know, and anger is a difficult one for us to release, because in our culture, you know, we don't think it's very acceptable to scream and shout and have a tantrum. So, you know, we use our voice, we use mantras to help us express more. They can also be very empowering, those postures, you know, and also grief can make us feel very disempowered. So it's sort of, you know, giving us some more strength. And then, you know, some very nurturing in the connection part, where we really nurture our inner child, developing a softer, more compassionate voice within. And yeah, just surrendering more into how we feel, essentially.
Interesting, though, you're saying about the anger and releasing of anger, and it isn't acceptable. But because I believe, because we don't express it and we don't scream and shout and stamp our feet when we feel the need to, it tends to be redirected. Road rage, ending up having a go at your loved ones when in fact they haven't really done anything wrong, but you're angry about something that happened earlier on, but you didn't let it out. So for me, like yourself, I've done a lot of personal development work and I've worked with coaches. And one of the things we are taught is to, you know, even if it's using songs, you know, to actually get it out. So it's lovely that you're saying about yoga poses and how they can help you, and the mantras to actually release some of what you're holding, to stop it being released in all of the wrong places.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we never know when we might end up having a grief burst, or, you know, having a short fuse at someone who isn't really deserving of it. But the yoga is an opportunity for us to have a really powerful release. And, you know, some people really connect with it, and obviously some people don't, and there's something for everybody, you know. But I do think it's a really really good for people to have, I always say, like a three-pronged approach in a way to their grief. So maybe do something, speaking to a therapist or in a group, do some body work, massage or hip acupuncture, and do something movement wise, whether it's yoga or running or boxing. We have to really take care of ourselves when in grief, because in the Chinese medicine practitioners, they say grief is the hardest of all of the processes to deal with. And that's why we particularly need to take care of ourselves, because it can really, it can be extremely toxic.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So as well as the yoga, you also mentioned breath work. So can you give us a little bit of information about that for people who don't know what that is?
Yes, so I teach something called revelation breath work, which is quite an intense breath, because you do it through the mouth and you repeat the same breath over and over again. And it builds up this breath to a song which is called the Primal Scream song. So again, that is an opportunity to have a big release and use your voice. And it's quite challenging at first, this breath, which is why I'm sort of there to help people stay with it and encouraging them to keep coming back to it, because, there is a strong sort of like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know if I like this. But the big release is just another great opportunity to scream, to cry, to let it all out. And then we go back again after that song into some more dynamic breathing. And again, this is just another way of releasing strong emotions.
What I'm hearing from you is that you're setting a safe space for people to do this. And also, because even as people will be listening to this, they'll be thinking, but once you've showed us, we can do that breath and we can do that release and we can do that primal scream, but you don't, because actually you can feel quite embarrassed to say doing it on your own. But when you're part of a group, and it's something I've done quite recently, when with my coach, is that when you're part of a group and you're all doing it together, it does encourage you and it does help you. And especially when you've got somebody coaching you through that, it sounds like actually it's really important that you're working in that space that you're creating.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think there's always power in being in a group, and even if we're on Zoom, it's a way that we are healing in community, which is really profound. And I think for the breath work in particular, I much prefer to do it on Zoom, because I don't really like hearing everybody else's screaming and crying and processing, and I say to people before we begin, if you're living with somebody, please let them know that you might be making these sounds and for them not to worry. And you can always scream into your pillow. We actually do the breathing on a bed as well, because your body temperature can really change during it, and you're laying down all the time and you can pull a blanket over you. So yeah, I do believe very much in the power of healing in community. And obviously when you're having coaching or therapy, there are some weeks when you think, oh, I don't know if I need this, or and then of course the next week you feel completely different. And it's that accountability of showing up with somebody who is not a friend, who's not going to tell you, oh, well, this happened like this to me, or trying to fix it, but somebody who knows a lot of tools that can help you, and somebody that's going to hold, like you were saying, a very safe space in order for you to really feel.
Yeah. And with you just saying then about people often do put their own grief onto others, and this is how I found, or then they start talking about themselves and their grief. And I think, as you've said, working with a professional with this is so important. So it's lovely to thank you very much for giving some more information. And then onto your book. So I know you've just shown us the cover of it, Conscious Grief. Where can people get it? And also, who do you suggest reads it is probably not quite the right thing, but who is it really aimed at then, maybe?
I mean, honestly, it's aimed at everybody because everybody has experienced grief on some level. And the book is available to buy on Amazon. I know some people are not always keen on Amazon. I do have books at home, so if people wanted to buy them directly, they could come to me. It's available on Audible as well for people who like to listen to books in the car, and it's available on Kindle too. And it's a very it's a concise book. It's not a long book, and I think sometimes that's what we really need when we're grieving, not a very dense and heavy read. It's nicely spaced out and laid out, with the consideration of that when we're grieving, we often don't have the capacity, and the concentration that we might have ordinarily. And at the end of each chapter, there's what I call heart work. So there's little exercises or journal prompts. I've left some pages in the back of the book for people to write notes. It's a very practical guide. And as I've said, I've included many people's stories in there. So it's not just me talking about my parents who died when I was younger, which somebody who may have just had a husband die, a wife die, a child die, they might think, well, I don't think we've got anything in common. But actually, I'm using other people's stories to illustrate certain points of, the benefits of conscious grief, as opposed to, pushing it down and not dealing with it in a conscious way.
So many people just become busy and really do use that, as you've said earlier on, to mask it. So anything that can be done to help people through grief, to me, is fantastic, because there need to be the resources out there, and accessible resources in many different ways, because not everybody wants to phone and speak to a bereavement counsellor, or grief counsellor. And so I think it's fantastic, the various things that you are doing, all of which can help people. And as you say, somebody might like yoga, somebody may like the breath work, somebody may wish to look at the conscious grief program, and some may just wish to read the book. So you've actually covered enough bases with what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for saying that, because it's not like one one approach fits all at all. As we know, it's a very unique process. And what I will say as well about being busy, I know that some people are like, am I doing this grief thing right? Or I'm now worried because I'm busy. And don't worry about that, because maybe now you don't have this space and time in your life. But your grief will be there, and it will be when your consciousness is ready, and when you maybe do have the space and time in your life, it will come. So it's never too late to grieve. When I think about it, my father died when I was 9, and it really took me like over 20 years to grieve him consciously. It took me moving to another country and really changing my life. And so some people might be, wait until they're retired and think, my gosh, I've got all this sadness in my heart. How can this be from something that was in my childhood? And that's just the way, the way it works for some of us. It can take many, many, many years to have that space and time of reflection. And when, like I said, when your consciousness is ready, things will come up to be processed.
That's really powerful. Oh, that's really powerful. Thank you very much. For people to get hold of you, how can they do that?
Well, my website is consciousgrief.co.uk. And there's you can sign up to my newsletter, which honestly is the best thing at the moment, because that lists the dates when I'm doing my classes. So if you like Instagram, you can follow me on Tara_Nash_Seeker, Seeker, and I am on Facebook as well. So yeah, those are the 3 online ways of getting hold of me. My email address is actually tara@tara-nash.com.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving out the details of how people can contact you. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me this morning. Thanks, Tara.
Well, thank you so much as well, Dale. And thank you to everyone who's been listening.